Welcome to Redefining ABCD. All right. So I'll just go ahead into the introduction.
Cool.
Okay. So hey everyone, in this week's Larger Than Us episode, we will be having a conversation surrounding the stigmas around divorce in our community and navigating the cultural traditions and perspectives that limit women and individuals in relationships. Joining us in our conversation today is Natasha Mahtani, a relationship and divorce coach who is passionate about empowering women to cut through cultural conditioning and thrive in their relationships. She has made it her mission through her coaching and services to destigmatize divorce in the South Asian diaspora and future-proof relationships. So, without further ado, welcome Natasha, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Yeah, just to start us off, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got started as a relationship and divorce coach?
Yeah, of course. So I was a life coach for a really long time. And then when I went through the experience of divorce myself about, 10 years ago now, I really felt like I wanted to help women who within that kind of space are going through similar things. And I remember doing some training with Tony Robbins, and he was like talking about finding your dot, and I was like, yeah, that's the woman I want to help, the South Asian woman who's experiencing divorce and just feels all the emotions that I went through. So I did some further training and became an accredited divorce coach. But I'd always find myself saying things like, yeah, I'm Natasha, the divorce coach that doesn't want anyone to get divorced. And also, as I started seeing more and more clients, I realized that a lot of people who were getting divorced really didn't need to if they had, had some help or coaching within their relationship. So I did some further training and became a certified relationship coach, and which is why I have both. I do them both now, but I really want to focus on the relationships because I think so many of them can be saved.
Right. And I think that's important to highlight, especially because in our community there is such a huge fear of divorce,
Mm,
and such a, I guess, such an emphasis on the family unit. And I don't know, I always found it like I understand where that fear came from, but I think it is something that needs to be explored, and I'm happy that you've been able to kind of make your way and find a space for yourself, and to then share your experience with your own divorce, and also share how other women can help um, work work with their feelings about it. I guess kind of going into that, I mean, you kind of mentioned that, you mentioned your divorce, but can you go a little bit into it, if you're comfortable? Would you be able to talk about your personal journey with divorce, and how did you come to that point, and what were some of the events leading up to that point?
yeah. So, like most people, I never expected to get divorced. I guess no one goes into their marriage thinking, oh, it's going to end. And when it did, it was, it was a real journey to kind of get through all those emotions because divorce is often likened to death in that you go through that kind of grieving process. But there were two emotions that really started coming up for me, which didn't really feel normal. So, one of them was shame, and the other was a real sense of failure. So I feel like with Desi culture, there's a lot of pressure that's put on women to make a marriage work, to compromise, to adapt, to allow one's husband to sort of quote unquote do what he needs to do and almost suck it up when things aren't great. And I didn't like that. I didn't like those emotions. And I thought, well, if I feel that way, then I'm sure there are many other women who feel the same. But a lot of the reason why, like in the lead up, as you asked, in the lead up to getting divorced, I guess I can look back now, and hindsight is 2020, and think there were so many red flags. There were so many red flags. But because I had been raised, and funny enough, not even by my parents, I grew up in a pretty liberal household, but by society around me at large as like the good girl, the responsible one. You make a marriage work. The first 5 years of your marriage are the hardest. Like, you've just got to like put up with it. You have to like make sure your in-laws are really happy. If your in-laws are really happy, you have them like, in the palm of your hand, and stuff like that is said to girls. And I think if I was the person I am today, I probably never would have got married to him, to be honest, but I would have seen those red flags and recognized them for what they are rather than justifying them. And I think I justified so many of them for so long because I thought, well, the first 5 years are meant to be really hard. And just for context, I was married for 5.5.
Right, right.
So I think it's all of, all of those things. So I wanted to be there then, for those women going through that, to support them. And like I said earlier, I was already a life coach and it was something I loved. So then transitioning to being a divorce coach and then a relationship coach then came quite naturally.
Yeah, it's important. It's true that you brought up that the two main emotions that women feel oftentimes when they're put in those situations is shame and
Mm,
failure, because I feel like there's a lot of expectations put onto women, but not necessarily valued for taking on those expectations. So
yeah.
I think it's super important that that you're sharing that those are emotions you'll like potentially like feel if you're in that situation, but it's not normal. Like you shouldn't need to struggle if you don't have to.
Exactly. And I always say to people that just because it's common doesn't make it normal. And I think sometimes when things are so common, especially within our South Asian culture, it's almost like it's normalized. So, a man acting a certain way, or a mother-in-law acting a certain way. I mean, I'm generalizing. Sometimes it is the woman, but you know what I
Right.
mean? Um, it's almost like, oh yeah, but that's what they're like. And I'm like, no, just because it's common doesn't mean it's acceptable. It doesn't mean that it's normal, and we need to talk about it.
Mhm. Yeah, and it goes to show, I think that type of behavior, we see it as like when we go into our future relationships, we base it on like what we've seen in our lives. So how our
Hmm.
parents interact. So we technically like model that behavior. So it's like kind of a trigger for like in like for your kids or your future people who are like in your family to kind of carry on that type of behavior and think it's acceptable too.
Yeah, I think for me, even making the decision to get divorced was almost like breaking that generational, well, small t trauma, but breaking that generational kind of repetitive behavior where I was just going to be the next generation who then just accepted any way that I was treated or anything that was said, all in the name of like keeping things together.
Mhm. Right, yeah. That's a good way of leading into our next question is part of that shame and feeling of failure comes with like those types of statements or like that outward facing thing our South Asian culture or community tend to do, like what will people think, or this doesn't look good outside, or like whatever your actions are internally might reflect on who you are as a person outside, like those types of statements of being very much like the quote unquote politician
Mm,
that you have to be in your community with some of the personalities that we have. And
yep.
so I guess kind of reflecting back on your experience with divorce and having to handle your family, maybe your people in your community, your friends, like how did you handle these like types of situations, or if you were ever given these types of like comments towards like what you were going through personally, how did you handle or navigate that?
Yeah. So I got really lucky in that my parents, once I'd made the decision and told them, were really supportive. And remember, I had a 15-month-old, when I moved back home, I had a 15-month-old. And I remember at the time I had an uncle and aunt, well, my mum's uncle and aunt. And, they kind of sat her down and was like, she has a child, so you should send her back. And bear in mind, at that point, I had made my decision already, but it was the idea that my parents should tell me what to do. And my mom said, well, because she has a child, I won't. So I was really lucky, with that. But, she had a real point there. Like so many people stay together for the sake of their kids, but all the research, because I'm currently writing a book, and all the research has shown that it's much healthier and has a better outcome for the child if the parents are happily separated instead of unhappily married. But the other point that, I'd just like to make in terms of handling various statements is that I truly believe that people will meet you where you're at. So if you throw yourself a pity party, they'll feel pity. But I feel like if you're confident in your choice, they meet you there. And so, and I know it's not easy, I'll put my hand up and say that I felt like a victim probably for the first 2 years. And that's where a coach can really help you come through those emotions. But I think that being mindful of how you respond to people when they say things. It's like, oh, they might say something and you're like, oh, ask about your husband or something. And if you're like, oh, yeah, I'm divorced, then immediately they're like, oh, I'm so sorry. And then, their whole thing is kind of like, poor thing, Bechari. And suddenly they see you as like this victim. Whereas if you're kind of like, yeah, this is what it is, and you're a lot more confident, they meet you there. And then it'll be like, oh yeah, she knows what she's doing, she's strong. And suddenly their entire perspective changes based on how you how you kind of respond to them. And I think that's really important, because sometimes, and it sounds awful but it's true, that a lot of people enjoy the pity. It's like, oh, poor thing, like this happened to her, and then blame kind of shifts to the other person, and then it's like, yeah, poor me. Whereas I think it's not a fun place to be in the long term. I think. I mean, you can do that for the first year. I'm not denying anybody's feelings. Like I said, I felt like a real victim, for I'd say 2 years until the divorce finally came through. But once it did, I really embraced it and thought, well, no, this is it, and I'm gonna like live my life, be happy, be confident.
I kind of going off that point that you made. I think pity specifically is something that is so kind of again normalized within our community and in certain ways, and I it's it's very easy to tell when someone is very used to giving pity, and not even used to, but also just that's just like how they talk. This is just the way they live with, oh, a problem, like, oh, I feel bad for them, like it's just like kind of almost cultivating this gossip sort of culture around a
Mm.
very big life event that's happened, and instead of feeling genuine empathy or concern, or asking, oh, are you okay, are you helpful, it's so like, oh, are you like, oh, do you need help, oh, I'm sorry, like it's just like this almost performative sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it is interesting. I was This kind of also occurred to me as you were talking. Do you think that that pity or the way that people kind of respond to someone within our community getting a divorce has anything to do with whether they had a love marriage versus an arranged marriage? Do you think those comments kind of shift or change depending on the two, or do you think they're both kind of aggressive regardless of which one, which kind of marriage you
Yeah.
had?
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. I'd never thought about it like that. I had a quote unquote love marriage.
Right, right.
So it's almost like people don't expect it, or they expect it less if it's a love marriage, because it's like, oh, but there's this idea that, oh, they chose each other. So how could they not have known certain things? But yeah, I'm not sure if there's like people's pity is different whether you had like a love marriage or arranged marriage. I think it just comes down to how you respond. But the overarching feeling, I think, with either of them is just that, like, poor you sort of thing, like this happened to you. Even though for many cases we should be celebrating the fact that someone had the courage to walk away from what you don't know, but what could have possibly been a really abusive relationship. And, I know it sounds so awful, but I remember at one point when I was married and things were like pretty bad, and there was a lot of sort of emotional and verbal abuse. But I remember at one point thinking, and I hate myself now for thinking this, and I'm so grateful that it didn't happen. But I remember thinking, well, if he just hit me, it'd be a lot easier to
Mm.
go back and be like, this happened. And that sounds so awful, and I'm really grateful that he didn't ever. But I remember thinking it because it was this idea that it wouldn't be good enough to go back and say, well, there was other forms of abuse as opposed to physical. And I think that's something else within our culture, because I still hear so many people of the older generation, so maybe women and men who are in their 60s now, who will still see a woman get divorced now and say something like, but he didn't hit her. And you're like,
Mm.
is that the benchmark? Like, is that it? Is that where, like, is that what it has to be before it's okay for her to say, I deserve joy, I deserve happiness, like, I don't deserve this? So yeah, we've got a lot of work to do.
It's always worse when it's coming from another woman, I feel like. Because I feel like
Yeah.
oftentimes the biggest amount of like triggers for these types of situations is another woman being like, oh, you can't handle it, or this is just the way that life is, suck it up. And so that's really awful when I don't know, it's always like, I don't know, I don't know if it's just our community or if it's just the way things are, because women against women happens so often, I guess, in these
Hmm.
types of situations, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I think also there's that older generation kind of feels like they had it even worse. So if you have a mother-in-law that doesn't, like scream at you all the time, it's almost like, oh, you're lucky because you should have seen the way I had it. And I'm like,
Yeah.
there's
Mm.
a lot more to it than that.
There's a lot of compare contrast, I feel like, between the ladies, and honestly, those comments and stuff, especially coming from like your family itself, that, I mean, that's just that hurts even more, because it's like, oh, when I'm at my lowest, my own family is not in my corner, or like my own even
Mm,
extended family, or people, like it's just kind of a difficult situation,
mm.
to kind of
But
be in.
yeah, to navigate. Yeah, but to just on that point, that particular uncle and aunt, I remember sitting down with them much later than the summer because it was May that I
Mhm.
came home, and just being like, "This is what happened," and it really explaining it, and they've been absolutely amazing after that. And I think that just being open and really frank and just talking to people as opposed to, and that also comes from owning what's happening as opposed to like sitting in your home and shutting your door and closing the world out and letting people assume things as opposed to you just being like, this is it. They are amazing. They're so good to us now.
So, I guess kind of shifting gears, or maybe kind of going off that a little bit, can you share some of the cultural nuances you've seen that affect women and relationships within the South Asian community, specifically in while you're in marriage? Like, what kind of expectations do people have while you're in marriage, and what kind of expectations do they have when when if you get divorced, or when you're out and about? Is there an automatic sort of like, okay, so what's next? Like, what are you doing now? Like, what kind of what kind of comments or cultural nuances does that kind of tie into?
Yeah. So I think in terms of the cultural nuances that I've seen affecting like women and relationships in the South Asian community, there's definitely, there's a lot of pressure that is put on women to look a certain way, know how to cook, raise smart, beautiful children, and in many cases now work as well. But while working a full-time job, still taking on that emotional labor of the household because, heaven forbid your husband like cooks or does the washing up, but it's different in the West. I think it's moving a bit more. So whether in the States or in the UK, or in Europe, it's changing a bit. But in Asia, India, and like West Africa, I've kind of lived in all those places, grown up in some of them. There's no expectation on the men to do any of the extra stuff, and I think that we're doing a disservice to our women, but also to our men, right? Because surely we should have higher expectations for men, but there's also an expectation, I think, that women hold a marriage together, right? But that's a huge burden. And then when a marriage doesn't work out, then people's first response, unless it's obviously very obvious that a husband was a kind of quote unquote bad guy, but people's first response are things like, oh, she couldn't adjust, or girls these days, and then insert any number of reasons. But yeah, I'm really passionate about changing the conversation around divorce and relationships as well, because I feel like when you do end up, or if you do end up getting divorced, very often people's first or second response after they've had something to say is also, okay, so let's get her remarried quickly, almost, because, and I'm like, wait, you've given yourself no time to heal, you've given yourself no time to process and talk about what it is that you've experienced. You just want to take a girl or woman and just put her into the next relationship, and it doesn't work like that. Like, she needs to have that time to get through it, because I also think that if there was anything that she was doing, whether that was something she was actually doing or something she was accepting, because when you accept things, it's also you allowing things to happen, then she needs to understand that so it's not repeated in her next relationship, right? So also just getting over the idea that a woman shouldn't be single.
Right, right.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so true. There's so many like not traditions, but like stigmas or like conditions for women like post marriage. Like if you're divorced or if you're a widow, like you can't attend like marriages and things like that because that gives like a bad omen to the future couple. And like there's
Mm,
so many like even like things like that, just like that like once you're like branded, there's like so many conditions of things that you can't really do, and it's pretty awful um to think about. But yeah, and kind of
yeah.
going back into the gender roles aspect of it. I think that's also super important that you're bringing up, because it's interesting that you said like the women have to like keep the marriage together. Because oftentimes I hear older generation, what they say is like, oh, if my wife wasn't here, I wouldn't like the husband would be like, I would not survive. Like I don't know how to cook, I don't know how to clean, so I would not be able to live a day without her. And that's like their way of showing appreciation. And it's like it's very interesting because like it's not sustainable, like you said.
No,
Um,
but on the flip side, it's showing appreciation because it's like almost like a backhanded compliment because
that's
it's,
true.
you know what I mean? It's like, I can't live without my wife. Oh, everyone's like, oh, so sweet. See how much he loves his wife. I'm like, wait, also, like, shouldn't he be trying? Because,
Right.
so it's like, oh, I couldn't do it. I know, but I'm also not doing it.
Right, yeah. Yeah, I guess my curiosity is, do you think going into like these like younger generations, how should they kind of like what's the type of mindset you think that they should kind of go into, to prevent having those types of conversations when they're like very old and being like, I can't live without my wife because I don't know how to cook and things like that.
Yeah. So I think it's an interesting question because we often think, oh, you just have to ask him to do that. And it's not as easy as that. So it's not as easy as just saying to your partner, if you have a partner or whatever, like, okay, I need you to do, like, we need to split the chores and I need you to do this or whatever. It's also about a woman thinking to herself, why do I feel the need to do everything and not allow him to do some of the things? And is it because I was always told that, you should make sure you keep your house tidy. Like if people come around the house a mess, you're the one who's going to, be responsible for it. Or, because I remember I had a client once and she'd get really frustrated when she'd ask her husband to do something, like say the dishes, and he was in charge and he'd put the dish into the sink and didn't wash it then.
Mm.
And I was like, okay, what's the issue? She's like, well, it's sitting in the sink. And I was like, okay, but do you have a shallow sink or a deep sink? She's like, no, pretty deep sink. I'm like, from the kitchen, can you see it in the sink? And she was like, no. I'm like, okay, so you can't see it in the sink. you know, I was like, so what's the problem with it being in the sink if he wants to then come like 5 o'clock or whatever, have a whole bunch of things and then do all the washing up at one point instead of just doing each bowl at a time or cup at a time? And she really had to think about it. And she was like, and it turns out that she was Ghanaian. So, and culturally, they're very similar to us. And she was just like, well, I don't know. My mom kept the house spotless, and she did all of this, and she did all of that. And if I don't, it just means I'm not a good mom or a wife. And I was
Mm,
like, that's the issue. So sometimes we have to allow the men in our lives to actually step up and do it. But a lot of times, women don't actually allow them, and so I think that must be acknowledged because that's like half the battle as well.
that's so true, yeah. Yeah, and that kind of goes into our next question a little bit. I know we've talked about in the past, like just like the divorce having a certain stigma in our community, and I mean, in the perspective of like us, like when we were younger, we've had that happen in our community where someone, like a couple, our parents did get divorced, and after that, how it was treated was like we never really like talked about them again, or they just kind of like left
Mhm.
the friend circle and we never really like acknowledged it, and it was just kind of like a let's put it to the side, this never really happened type of experience that happened to in the community. So I think kind of looking at that as kind of like what is kind of like a typical experience or like a common experience of when someone like was saying that they're going to separate from their partner, how do you think we could change the conversation so that those types of experiences don't necessarily happen, or they're handled in a little bit more healthier way so that people who are in relationships don't feel like they have to stay in it for the sake of like their face, or just keeping it together?
Mm. So I think just being more open, um, educating people or our parents, if you feel it's the parents saying something. When I say educating them, I mean, you know, giving them examples of what is really happening in the world and also calling them out on things. So, not being afraid if you're in a group and someone says something either about a woman who might be experiencing something and not, and, calling them out and being like, hey, that's not particularly kind. Or like, I'm sure she could use our support, not our criticism, So I think being unafraid to be supportive, because I feel like sometimes people don't know what to say, right? So they just don't say anything at all. I remember when I moved back, I moved from Hong Kong to London. So it's, so far away from what I was so used to, and everyone, all my friends who lived there. And there was many people who were great, but there were many people who I considered really good friends who I just never heard from again. And people always like, oh, but I don't know what to say. And I'm like,
Mm.
all you have to say is, hey, I heard what happened. I'm sorry. Thinking of you here if you want to talk. Don't say, hey, I heard what happened. Like just send them a one liner so they know, like, okay, cool. She's not asking me many questions. When I'm ready, I might call her, but I know that she's like, just like, it's just send your support. That's not you choosing sides. That's not you, um, trying to find out information or have a bit of a gossip or whatever. It's just you being like, hey, I heard this is what you're going through and stuff. And this is what I mean. Like, if someone loses a parent or loses a sibling or loses a child or just loses anyone in their lives, instinctively you grab your phone and just say, hey, I just heard what happened. I'm really, really sorry. Here if you want to talk. And I'm like, but it's the same thing. It's divorce is a loss. It's a loss of that relationship. And so don't, just pick up the phone and send the person a message, I think.
I think that's important that you bring that up because, I've always personally wondered how to kind of approach a friend who has gone through a loss because it's something that I personally struggle with. I don't know what to say, and I almost feel like, oh, me being around or asking questions is going to cause more of a burden than me not doing anything at all. And I think that's like really good advice, especially for friends who are watching maybe a friend who's dealing with something, divorce, loss, anything. And it, I don't know, it's just so simple. And like, I don't know, especially in like a moment like that, it is very hard to kind of just reach out and do that. But
Yeah.
I think it's important too. um,
Yeah.
um,
So, I mean, I have a question. What do you feel makes it hard to reach out in that moment? Like, what are you afraid they're going to think or say or do?
this might just be a personal problem, but I just know
Mm.
that I tend to blurt things out sometimes that are probably not ideal for any particular. Like, it's just not. I have a track record of saying the wrong things at wrong times, so I just feel like in those situations, it's such a fragile state that it's like, oh, someone else will take care. Someone else has to do this. I can't. I don't know how to do this. I don't know.
Yeah.
And
No,
I don't
that's
know.
great that you can articulate that, and I think it's wonderful because you're self-aware, first of all, so you're aware that that's what it is, but also, you know, understanding of the fact that you may feel like you might say something that they wouldn't want to hear then, which is why, like I said, send a message so you don't feel like you're picking up the phone and it's like, oh, don't know what to say, but this way you've just sent the message and they know you're thinking of them without any pressure whatsoever for them to have a conversation or to even to answer any questions.
Right.
Yeah. And it's also good. It's a good way I feel of like setting that boundary of like you can come to when you're ready. Because oftentimes I feel like even in like in our community when like if something like a loss were to happen in like a funeral, people are just ready to just jump in and
Mhm.
like I want to show you how much I can help you because I want to show you how much of a friend I can be. Even in like not even just like our culture, but like even like in Western culture, you see like people will show up with food or like they'll just constantly be around you, and so I feel like this way it like helps you give the boundary to process it, but then you know you're not alone because oftentimes you go into a deep rabbit hole when you go through loss, and if no one is there to reach out to, then you start thinking, were those people ever really my friends? Like kind of like what you were saying with like when you got divorced.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah, and that's a really awful feeling.
Right. Right.
yeah. Out of curiosity, I guess in the perspective of like a child who is seeing their parents getting divorced,
Mm.
what are some conversations that you think that could be helpful or how ways to reach out in that perspective? Because I feel like that's a little bit different of a situation and dynamic, and I don't know if any like personal experience has helped you gain that advice, but like what in that perspective, if it was like a child seeing their parents separate, what are some ways that we can kind of navigate those conversations?
Yeah, that's a great question because I think unfortunately there are many situations where the child should be at the forefront of everything and they're not. So my situation's a little bit unique. My ex-husband chose to have nothing to do with us. And so it's just me and my kids. So when he was, I think this happened just around the age of 3. So from the age of 3, I would always like, that's when the kind of um, what's the word I'm looking for? Almost like the estrangement happened.
Mm.
From the age of 3, I would always say to him, family are the people, well, family are the people who love you, but I'd say some people, have only a mom, some people have only a dad, some people live with their grandparents, some people have 2 moms, some people have 2 dads, some people, live with aunties and uncles. But at the end of the day, family are the people who love you. Who is your family? And he was 3, and he'd be like, Mama and Ada, and talk about my parents and my brother and, my mom. And I'm like, cool, yeah, and so he had it kind of almost drilled in from a really young age that family were the people that loved you and the people that cared about you and were around, because I never wanted him to feel that sense of lack, that he didn't have that father. But I think it changes as they get older, and then you're managing a whole bunch of other emotions. When they're 3, they're like, yeah, anyone who loves me. And then so it's like, wait a minute, why are all my friends talking about their dads and I can't? But I think even just a couple putting aside how they feel in that moment, getting some sort of mediation, sitting down with their child together, and really saying that, like, we might not love each other anymore, but we really, really love you. And I think when it comes to co-parenting as well, that's the thing. Like, put your child at the center of it. So if you don't want to say something to your ex-wife or your ex-husband or whatever, but just think, how's this going to affect my child? Because children, especially if they're much younger, their kind of little brains end up almost taking responsibility. So for an example, and there's so many books on this, but if there's a parent who's very, very shouty, that child brain will automatically think, what have I done wrong? And then you'll see that child desperately trying to like overcompensate to keep their parent happy, even though that shouty parent has, it's like a race car. Sorry. Even though that shouty parent has that child has nothing to do with that shouty parent, you'll find that child trying to overcompensate to keep that parent happy. And it's the same thing within divorce. If a child is not, and that you can't tell a child that I love you too much. So
Mm.
if a child is constantly told, like, we love you, we can't be together, but we love you, and they're able to do things together and be cordial, that child won't fall into the kind of arena of thinking, did I do something wrong? My parents have split up. And it helps them later take ownership, like to ownership for the fact that it was their parents' choice and it had nothing to do with them. But if you don't do that, you don't have those conversations, they'll end up thinking, maybe it was me.
I think it's important to bring up because I feel like when, I mean, I've never experienced this obviously, but I feel like if when women are in a relationship and thinking about even breaking up or in a marriage and they're getting divorced, I think kids are the first thing that comes to mind. Like, oh, what
Yeah.
are my kids? How are my kids going to be affected by this? I think it's a huge concern. Again, bringing it back to the whole, like, in our culture specifically, the idea of family and the family unit and that pressure that you feel of being this like picture perfect background,
Mm,
it that I think that's just another sort of hurdle that you have to kind of fight before finally making that decision, of splitting, and I guess kind of going off of that, kind of going off of that, like the whole picture perfect background, how do you think South Asian women can be empower themselves and control their narrative, um, leading up to the divorce and also post divorce?
So I did allude to this earlier, but just being confident. So, see a coach or a therapist, work on yourself, but even things like, make eye contact when someone asks where your husband is, like check your body language. Because I feel like people can tell how you feel about your divorce. And if you feel shame, like if you end up feeling shame, they'll oftentimes meet you there or meet you with pity. So, own it. It's happened, embrace it. And that way you end up controlling the narrative. Like, don't sort of over explain, don't over apologize. Be, if it was your decision, be strong in your decision. Obviously, if it wasn't, that's a totally different thing, but the idea is the same. But I think just, I remember once talking to someone and they asked me about my husband, and I said, oh, I said, first I said, oh, I'm divorced. And they were like, oh, I'm so sorry. And then I was like, oh no, like I'm really happily divorced. And they were like, oh, okay. And they changed. They got so animated because it's almost like an oxymoron. Like, how could she possibly be happy and divorced? So maybe that should be the name of the book, Divorced and Happy.
Mm, that is, I would buy that book. I mean, okay, I guess like also like talking a little bit about, you mentioned on your platform that you help support individuals future proof their relationships to, hopefully prevent these kind of, I mean, thinking of divorce and going down that route. Could you kind of expand more upon that kind of phrase of future proof your relationships, and some of the tactics you see for creating stronger, healthier relationships right off the bat?
Yeah, yes, for sure. In fact, I think on my website, I actually have a guide for creating stronger, healthier relationships. But I trained further to be a relationship coach because, I didn't want anyone to get divorced. And I think, like I said earlier, many people who get divorced don't need to necessarily, especially if they had the right support whilst like together. But I think most people come to a relationship coach when they've hit rock bottom.
Mm,
And it's a lot harder for us to get up from that, from that point when we're down there. So, in terms of tactics for creating a healthier relationship, communication is key. Obviously, we weren't taught how to communicate, as I think, as you said earlier, Kirti. Like, it was modeled to us by our parents, our caregivers, society around us, and then we took that blueprint of communication into our own relationship, and we communicate that way even if it's not working. And we don't think, well, it's very much like, well, this is the way that I communicate. And it's like, well, you can change it. And so the next thing based off of that is figure out what your love language is. So I don't know if you guys have heard of it, but there's a book called The Five Love Languages, yeah,
yes,
by
yes.
John Gray. And actually it seems so simple, but like it gives you such an insight into your relationship, into how you're able to express the way that you're feeling, like, and then have the other person receive that. So, if, for example, you're a woman and you have a partner whose love language is physical touch, but your love language isn't physical touch because you never saw that intimacy between your parents, but you always saw like your dad like take your mom's car out and fill petrol, or run all these little errands, and then so you think acts of service, you're going to feel really uncomfortable if he's constantly trying to put his arm around you or do something, and not doing the other things. And that's because that's the way you saw it. So I think understanding as well what your love languages are is really important. But also the big thing now, especially in today's day and age with phones, and this is for every relationship, not just like a husband and wife, whatever, is carve out time for each other. I feel like every relationship, there's four people, four things. It's
Right.
like the two people and then the two phones in their relationship. So, carve out time for each other. I think it's really important to nurture your relationship like you would a garden. If you left your garden unattended for months on end, you'd end up with like a whole bunch of weeds. And so your relationship is the same. You've got to, and it's not just, oh no, but we see each other all the time, we're living in the same house. It's like, okay, but how often are you actually stopping and talking to that person, making eye contact, putting your phone away, looking at them, asking how they're feeling, telling them something that upset you 2 days ago, like actually checking in with them. And I think that's something that a lot of relationships are starting to lose, especially when they then go on to have children, because it's like, oh, we've got kids, it's so busy. And it's like, exactly, you have kids, this is why you have to make sure you're nurturing your relationship, because this is going to be what they see. So sit down as much as you can, if not every night, and over the dinner table, and and chat and converse and put devices away and ask questions about each other's day, because just remember that you're modeling to your children what they're going to take into their relationship. So that should be important enough to you. So I think, yeah, I think those are the those are the kind of big ones. And I also have a relationship journal. Actually, it's I kind of created it about a month ago for people who maybe didn't felt like, okay, well, we don't quite need coaching or whatever, but it's 12 weeks. It's literally four prompts, so it takes 10 minutes of your time, but it really gives you the opportunity to kind of reflect on where you are with boundaries, where you are with communication, where you are with intimacy, where you are with even division of household chores, and then prompting. And then with that, you can then have a conversation and be like, hey, I did it think it's on Amazon worldwide, and I think in the States it's only like 13.99 or something. But it's like being able to say, oh, I did that, and I realized actually that when you do this, I really appreciate that. So can you do a little bit more of that? So simple, but we don't take the time to express that, I think, to our partners, to say, yeah, I like this a bit. I like this. I don't like that. We also
Yeah.
leave far too much to assumption. Sorry.
Oh yeah.
No,
We're
yeah,
just
yeah,
like, oh, well, we live together. He knows what I'm like. She knows what I'm like. So, and I'm like, but we change on a weekly, monthly basis based on podcasts we're listening to and shows we're watching and books we're reading. We're constantly changing who we are. If you're not communicating, that person could be sleeping right beside you for a whole year and not know that you suddenly have expanded your thinking on a particular topic based off a book that you read, as an example.
yeah. It's so true. It's assumptions and also expectations. I feel like a lot of times, like I expect my partner to do X, Y, Z, and
Mm.
then when they don't do, you're like, well, why did they do it? It was like, you never really fought like head on, like talked about it. So obviously, how are they supposed to read your mind? I feel like those go really hand in hand, with that. So that's a good point that you brought up. Yeah, I was about to say something and I forgot. Um, yes. Oh, kind of wanting to just talk a little bit. It kind of just thought about it when you were talking about post-divorce
Mm.
earlier. For an individual who just got out of like a relationship and like they took the time to heal and they've took the time to reflect for themselves, man or woman, um, what are some like I guess tips you might have for helping them get back on their feet and kind of go back into the world again to try to find someone if that is like what they want to do again?
Yeah, dating's terrifying.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. In this day and age too.
I was gonna say, and like I'm 39, and you guys are in your early 20s, and I think everybody is just like, what? It's
It's
terrifying.
terrible.
Yeah. um, one thing I think people are missing a trick, and that is actually being really open and vulnerable to people around you. So I decided I was going to get off all apps. I was just like, I was done. I couldn't take another, like, just random, although sometimes I do it too, so I'm not like totally blaming other people, but the random unmatched when I didn't, like, I was like, I literally said, yeah, cool, we can, like, what day works for you, for example. Unmatched, I'm like, was it something I said? But first of all, I'd say, it's not all about you. So don't take it so personally. If you're going to go out there and put yourself on dating apps to meet people, don't take it personally, because you have to have a pretty thick skin for it. But also, just be open to telling someone, yeah, like, I'm open to meeting new people. So I think initially, sometimes it's crazy because we all know everybody wants to be with somebody. Everybody's open about being on the dating apps, but you tell someone to just speak to a good friend or an aunt in another country that they might have, or someone, and just say, hey, you know, I would love to meet someone. If there's anyone you think who would be a good match, I'd love for you to make an introduction. And the idea of doing that's like, oh my God, how can I tell them that I want to be introduced to someone? I'm like, but you talk about the fact that you're on dating apps. Isn't that kind of the same thing? So I think just, it's almost like unlearning everything that we were told, and being more open. And I do a lot of work with people around, like, um how to kind of work with the universe and kind of manifest what you want, but also just, yeah, but kind of put it out there, having the right energy and having the right intentions and stuff like that. And I think, sitting down and thinking, and not Indian matchmaking style, but just sitting and thinking what it is that you want. So not that he has to be like tall, dark, handsome, and rich, but what is it that you want? How do you want to feel? How is it that you want that person to be with you? What do you want your future relationship to look like? Actually, when you have an idea of what it is that you want, the energy and the intention that you put out there will end up attracting that sort of person. And I definitely saw this when I started dating a few years after I got divorced, and I was not in a great place. And the people that I was attracting were exactly those sort of people, non-committal, like, because I was really non-committal, even though it took me a long time to realize it. And so I think just, yeah, getting really clear about what you want and what you need, and then going out there and being unafraid to be like, actually, this was what happened with my first experience, and I've done the work and I'm healed, but this is what I would like now. Being okay to admit it. I mean, the other big thing, it's funny because I was having a conversation with someone recently, and she's like, it's taken me 10 years of dating to realize I just want to be taken care of. But I feel like I'm a feminist. I can't say that. It's like, I can't say that I work, and I can't say that I just want to be taken care of. And I'm like, actually, that's what a lot of us have to learn to say. But it's almost like I feel like the pendulum swung so far the other way that if you're someone who has these open conversations and really wants to change the narrative around stuff, then it's like you can't dare say that you want a man to take care of you.
Right.
So I think it's about being really honest and open about what it is that you want and then going out with that intention.
Yeah, it really kind of goes back to what you said earlier about how you would handle like sharing a separation or a loss of a relationship too. It's like how the intention how you show it. It's very much very similar in how like if you are confident in what you want, you'll attract that as well. That's really interesting.
Mm.
Yeah. But yeah, kind of shifting gears a little bit. Sneha and I have talked about this before. It's really interesting. The pandemic really shifted a lot of the dynamics or social interactions that we have in relationships, especially within our age. Because when during the pandemic, we were like at like the height of everything in the sense of who were graduating college, people are like finding their first job, or they were trying to find a job, and like just like the heat of the moment, also being isolated.
Mm.
We felt kind of like a lot of our peers. I mean, personally for me, like everybody was just getting married in the pandemic or having kids. They were just,
Really?
yeah,
Yes.
like we
So
were
young.
all,
Yes.
let's say, like we were all like 22, I think 22, 23.
Wow.
Yeah, and
There's a
even
lot
some
of
people even,
there was a lot of I was gonna say there's a lot of relationships that started and then like a year later they were married and you're like, what happened? When? How? What? Why? What? I don't know when this happened. But okay. Great.
yeah, or
Oh.
it was like very short intervals where I don't know what was going on, but that resulted in like so many people getting married or so many people like just going straight to from like graduating high school, graduating college to having their first kid and like not really like taking the time for themselves, which personally for
Mm.
me that's what I kind of want to do before I get married and settle down.
Please do.
Yeah. So it was really interesting to see that. And that also led to people who kind of had that mindset of like, I want to take time for myself and kind of explore the world, do some of my individual goals before settling down, to feel pressured to be like, okay, now I need to find someone because
Mm.
everybody, I'm getting invited to like 7 weddings, 3 bridal parties, like things like that. People were getting so pressured to just, okay, let's just settle down and like just compromise and figure, like just get it over with. So I guess I don't know if that type of dynamic you kind of experienced or like seen during the pandemic in your circles, but I guess what are your thoughts on that? And what conversations do you think like people our age who are kind of like wanting to settle down faster than what you typically would expect, what conversations should they have before they settle down too? Because I think that's also super important.
Yeah, yeah, that the second part is super important. I'll get to that. But my question is who's pressurizing them? Is it pressure they're putting on themselves? Do you feel?
I I think what happened is the world ended, or everyone thought that
Yeah,
the world
felt.
ended, and then there was just this like everyone was like, I need to get it done. I want to just get it over with. The world is ending. Screw it. I'm just gonna go for it. And I think
Yeah.
that that mentality is what kind of spurred, relationships. In another way, I think it's also because there was just so much time on everyone's hands. There's a lot more
Mm.
time to just, I guess, talk, FaceTime, message, just talk to someone like that in close quarters. Like you have nothing better to do, so you might as well talk to them kind of attitude.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of sped up the timelines. And that's my theory, but I don't know. I don't know if you had any thoughts about that.
Yeah. So it's really interesting because I think that during the pandemic, there was almost like two sorts of people. One is what you're talking about. Maybe people who are afraid of being alone.
Mm,
And so are like, oh, okay, well, here's this opportunity. I've gotten to know this person, get to them a little better, get married. And then there were other people who did things like write books, start podcasts, finish their degrees and
right.
stuff like that. So, I feel like that's why I asked, where does the pressure come from? Like, is it their family or is it them themselves? Because I do think that if you're the kind of person who you wouldn't put that pressure on yourself if you're naturally the kind of person who wants to seek and explore, like you said, Kirti, with wanting to just do all of those things. And I think that that's so important because we're living a lot longer, and science is changing and everything like that. So even having having a child later. It's a possibility. I think a lot of people within the South Asian diaspora are also a lot more open to, you know, surrogacy, thanks Priyanka Chopra, but also adoption and stuff like that. So I think people should spend their 20s having fun, failing at lots of things, figuring out who they are, and what they want out of life, so that they can, go into their 30s and meet the right person. Not to say that those who got married in the pandemic, it's not the right person. So speaking of that kind of group, some of the conversations I think that they should have and sort of discuss for sure before settling down. It's a great question. I actually have a pinned post on my Instagram with a bunch of topics and questions that couples should talk about, but they include things like, what are your values and goals with regards to family, career, personal finances, and spirituality, or how do you prefer to communicate and handle conflict, right? So for some people, they'll go silent, and for some people they need to talk about it that night before they go to bed. And so, if you're someone who needs a day and the other person's someone who needs to talk about it then, how are you going to, kind of be in that conflict resolution mindset? And also things like, how do you navigate family and cultural expectations? So, if you're someone, for example, who grew up in a liberal family and you marry someone who's quite traditional, who expects you to maybe be at family lunch every Sunday, and, all of these, like, talk about it. Don't make assumptions that, oh, you get married, they're naturally going to be an extension of you and come to your family lunches every weekend. I think we don't talk enough about that. And what's your commitment to personal growth? That's another one. But the big one, I'd say, is money.
Mm.
So I've worked with women who have been married for 15 years and cannot have a conversation with their husband about money. But then they've been married for 15 years. They've got kids, 3 kids. So I think that money is a huge thing. Like, how do you want to save? Are we going to have like a joint bank account? I remember working with someone once, and she was a teacher, and her partner was in banking, and she said, "Oh yeah, we put money into an account, but I put like a percentage of it." And I thought, "Oh, okay, wait a minute." So I was like, "So say your rent is, I don't know, £2,000. You don't just split it as 1,000 each." She was like, "No, he earns that much more, so we each put in like a percentage of what we earn. So my percentage, to say, 50%. So my percentage might only be, so it's not 50% of the rent. It's 50% of their income that goes into a joint account. So
Mm.
hers is always going to be less." But that's a conversation they had, and he was okay with it because he chose to have a career that earned more. And that's the difference between equality and equity, right? And equity, that's what International Women's Day this year was all about: equity. Sometimes we don't talk about that enough. It's like, we should talk about it when it comes to money, because then when it comes to other household stuff, like we were referring to earlier, it's this idea, like, now both partners tend to work, that in today's day and age, but yet all that emotional labor. So say you're going to have kids, like, oh, got to buy them, we got to make sure they have their swimming uniform packed today, got to make sure that we buy a birthday card for that kid's birthday, got to make sure that their laundry is done in time, got to make sure that the packed lunch is ready. Most of the time the woman takes that role on. So, and the men doesn't. So, questions like that, just being really, really frank, like, how do you see life in the next 5 to 10 years? What jobs do you not like doing around the house? What do you do like doing? What are you willing to, like, you know get down and dirty with and do? Intimacy, don't make assumptions about intimacy. Talk about things. So there's so many things. I think it's just, yeah, being open to having conversation.
Yeah, I think money is such an important one because, like now, like if you're the breadwinner versus not, that just leads to more problems or more like pressure that builds up to like when a serious thing happens, it just kind of like blows over. Um, but out of curiosity, I know a lot of times in our community, if you're not like a person who provides income, you're a stay-at-home parent. Oftentimes that dynamic is a little bit different in our community, or it's seen as a little bit different. So I guess for those that like that type of thing, where if someone was thinking about being like a stay-at-home parent, how do they handle that kind of conversation of like financial responsibility, or let's say if it's a bad relationship where they need to leave and they don't have any financial ability to, like, how they could navigate, like,
Mm.
what are some of your thoughts around that type of position or perspective in our community?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And what I'm going to say may sound quite unorthodox, but I think it's really important because I see so many women who cannot leave a really bad situation simply because of money and because they've chosen to be a stay at home parent. So I think there has to be a conversation around, okay, raising children means I'm going to, be there for them, but I'm going to give up my job in order to do that. And it sounds crazy because it shouldn't be like an allowance, but I think it's really important that if a couple choose to do that, and the husband is working, for example, and he's earning enough, there should be some sort of like joint account, I guess, for the house where she can spend for that. But I also truly believe there should be a percentage of his income that goes into her account, that is for her to do whatever she wants with. So, because at the end of the day, if she was to go out and work and you were to get a nanny or any sort of childcare or put them in nursery, you're going to be paying for that. Like, and I don't know what it's like in the States, but in the UK, childcare is extortionate. Like, I know people who, women who worked, at the likes of like JP Morgan and Morgan Stanley, and if they sent one child, it kind of worked if they had one child, but if they had two children going to nursery and one wasn't in school yet, they'd come home with almost nothing.
Mm.
Like, because childcare is so expensive, like it's a couple of £1,000 a month, for full-time childcare for that child. And so by the time she's thinking of her commuting costs and everything else, it actually doesn't make sense for her to work. And so I do think that there should be a percentage that goes to her, because it's also then means if, sort of, God forbid, anything happens or their relationship goes south, she has something to stand on. Because otherwise, I remember, even in Nigeria, because culturally we're quite similar, I remember a lady coming up to me at the gym and saying, "Oh, I recognize you from Instagram." And we were chatting, and she's like, I seem to have everything. She was dressed amazingly in her like little cord set. She was dressed amazing. She looked great. She was like, on the surface, I have everything, but I'm completely trapped because I don't actually have any money.
Mm.
Like, I'm given everything and I can choose anything. I can travel. My kids are well dressed. She's well dressed. The gym membership is, not cheap. And yet she couldn't leave
Mm.
because she didn't have any money. And so money, yeah, money is one of those things that I will not stop harping on about, because if you don't have anything, and I've seen far too many men, and I'm not saying this is all men, but I it's what I've seen in my experience. If they're It's very easy for them to sort of walk away. Or if they're like within a family business or they have their own business, more so, where they don't actually like own the money, it's the companies, then it's very easy to say, I don't have anything, or I don't have, I can't support you in the same way. So I think if there's a conversation where you decide that the woman's going to be at the stay-at-home parent, I think even if it's a small amount, just a small percentage should go into a bank account that's completely hers and hers alone.
That's so true because if you're being a stay-at-home, you're like sacrificing a lot
Mm.
in time, and also like if you have to go back into the workforce after like however long you decided to stay, it's so much more harder. So I think that's a really, yeah, it's unorthodox because it's like a really new idea to think about, but I think it's a really good idea in the sense that they should be compensated because they're not, while they're not providing like income to a family, they're providing their time and they're sacrificing a lot just to be able to make sure that the family is healthy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess
Yeah.
as we wrap the episode, this has been an amazing conversation, and I feel like we can just keep going on for all day,
Yeah.
and just have so many thoughts. But can you just as a final sort of question, what's like some last advice that you'd give to anyone who might maybe be thinking of leaving their partner, or feel like they're in an unhealthy environment, and want to break out of this sort of like stuck mindset? What kind of advice would you give them?
The first thing I would say, even though it sounds like a bit of a cliche and very like woo, is develop a gratitude practice. So if you're in a really stuck place where you cannot see that light at the end of the tunnel, start a gratitude practice. It doesn't have, you don't have to write it down. It doesn't have to be in a notebook, even on your phone, in the notes section. Every evening, just sit down before you go to bed and write 5 things you're grateful for. And on a day where you're like, nothing, there's nothing I'm grateful for today. Like it's really bad. Be like, I woke up today. I can breathe. My health is okay. I have food on my plate. And you're already doing so much better than a large percentage of the world. So developing a gratitude practice has scientifically been proven to really shift your mindset, because the more that, it's like it's a Tony Robbins phrase. It's like where attention goes, energy flows. And so if you're putting your attention on, this is so bad, he did this today, or she did this today, or I feel so stuck, I can't get out, like I'm so fed up, and it's self-fulfilling prophecy. Like that's just, you're going to keep continuing feeling that way. Whereas if you develop gratitude practice, like I said, 5 things a day, you will start to see the shift, because it's almost like you're telling your mind that there's still so much good here, there's still so much, like, good. So I think that would be the biggest thing that I would tell someone to start with. And then there's other things, but I think just starting with a gratitude practice can be pretty life changing.
Yeah, like start small and grow from there. I totally understand.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no pressure, to be like, oh, I'm going to meditate for
Right.
1 hour every day. I'm going to like do this. I'm going to do that. I'm like, just start a consistent gratitude practice. I say, and I actually challenge anyone who listens to this podcast, like if you do it for 30 days and then come find me on Instagram and tell me your life changed, because I can almost guarantee you that your life, there'll be aspects of your life that will be transformed by developing a consistent gratitude practice.
Awesome. Yeah. And with that, we'll conclude our episode today. Thank you so much, Natasha, for coming onto our
Thanks.
podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, and we really appreciate your time giving us and being able to have the conversation to talk about the stigma surrounding divorce and and how we can build healthy relationships. So thank you for that. And also thank you to our listeners for tuning in and sticking with us to the very end. If you would like to learn more about Natasha's services or get in touch with her, just check out our episode description and we'll link her website and socials in there so you can reach out to her, learn more about her platform. So yeah, once again, thanks Natasha for joining us today.
Great. Thank you.
So before you kind of leave us today, I wanted to give a quick shout out to Ravi Ray Audio. You might have heard that our intro and outro music is a little bit different this season and is definitely upgraded to a next level. That's all thanks to Ravi Ray, who was our last guest in season 2, and he agreed to help us out with our music for season 3. So thank you so much, Ravi Ray, for all your help. And if you guys want to get in contact with him to collaborate with any projects or work with Ravi Ray Audio, we are linking his information to the episode description so you can reach out to him or see all the other projects he's done. And thanks again, Ravi, and we'll see you guys all in the next one.